Hello everyone, this is the intro to parliamentary format, speeches, and rules. The parliamentary format at Osterweis is quite different from other formats like Public Forum or Lincoln Douglas that are often run on the high school circuit. Therefore, it is helpful for us to give you a brief overview of which speeches there are, what the speaker rules are, and what the important rules are. So let's dive in. Firstly, let's talk about the speaker rules. Each debate has 4 speakers, with 2 on the government team and 2 on the opposition team. The government team speakers are named the Prime Minister and the Member of Government, with the Prime Minister being the first to speak. The members of the opposition team are named the Leader of Opposition and the Member of Opposition, with the Leader of Opposition first to speak among the opposition speakers. You'll also notice something called this house, for example, this house prefers or this house would. That is part of the motion, and you'll get to hear about motions in the second video later on. But essentially, let's talk about the speaker positions here. The Prime Minister will introduce and give the first speech, also providing an interpretation of the motion. That's very important because you need to model essentially what the world looks like if the motion were to pass, and that's really important. The Prime Minister also gives the last speech. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And then after that, you'll have the Leader of Opposition who speaks after the Prime Minister. After that, it's the Member of Government. After that, the Member of Opposition. Then back to the Leader of Opposition. And finally, the Prime Minister will close out the entire round of speeches. So now let's look at a stylized version of what the speech's layout looks like. Remember that all speeches have a grace period of 30 seconds in addition to the times shown here. But essentially, the first 2 speeches are named the constructives. You have the Prime Minister constructive, then the Leader of Opposition constructives, then MG and MO as previously mentioned. But there's an interesting characteristic with the rebuttal speeches because note how the Leader of Opposition goes first, even though the Prime Minister was the one to start all of the speeches at the beginning. So that's important to note. But essentially, the last 2 speeches are called rebuttal speeches, and they're somewhat shorter than the constructive speeches. And those are really important because you can consider them as ways to crystallize the round and talk about the most important arguments that have been presented. So I'll pause for just a moment here so you can get a sense of how long the speeches are and what the purpose of each speech is. Now let's talk about some important rules that differ from most types of high school debate. Firstly, teams are not allowed to use prepared evidence. That's an important difference from PF, LD, and other formats like that because you cannot use internet for research. You can use a shared doc for flowing or notes, but the point is that you should generate structural reasons for why an argument might be true or false, rather than relying on citations or internet sources to prove your point. The second important rule is that each round has a motion, which means you do not get to know about it ahead of time. Instead, the motion is announced just 15 minutes before the start time of a round. That means teams have 15 minutes to clarify the motions with the tab team if they need to, and also to prepare their arguments. During this time, each team also needs to travel to their designated debate room. So there is 15 minutes, and that means the rounds are generally more impromptu. There is more spontaneous argumentation going on than you would see in PF, LD, CX, or etc. That's an important thing to note. There's also no prep time during the round, which means you cannot stop the round. This is unlike PF, where you could, for example, take 2 minutes of prep time. That is not part of the rules in parliamentary debate, no prep time. The fourth rule is that teams should not be giving any written versions of their arguments to the judges or the opposing teams. For example, in PF, you may have systems such as disclosure. That is not an allowed version of the rule in parliamentary debate. It means you should not disclose your arguments or your cases in writing to any of the other members of the round except your own team. Something important to note. The fifth and last important rule is that you cannot make new arguments during the rebuttal speeches. And this is very important, something to always remember as a prime minister or as the leader of opposition, is that you cannot simply come up with a new argument and try to win the round through that way. Instead, the only thing you can do is evaluate the arguments that have already been made in the round and also introduce new weighing. And in fact, we encourage you to think a lot about weighing during the rebuttal speeches because that's the whole point. The point is to summarize the important arguments and then figure out which ones are most important and why. Therefore, remember once again, no new arguments during rebuttal speeches. That's the last two speeches because it violates the rules. However, new weighing is allowed. There is one small exception. If the opposition team makes new arguments in the member of opposition speech, that's the fourth speech overall, then the Prime Minister has a chance to give responses to the arguments made in the MO. That's because otherwise the government team will have absolutely no chance to respond to those arguments. So that is one small exception to note. Lastly, we're going to talk about important procedures during the round. There are essentially three types of points. The first point is points of clarification. That happens directly after the government team provides their interpretation and modeling of the motion. They'll generally pause for questions from the opposition team, for example, things that are unclear with the model, or simply questions about the scope of how the government team has modeled the motion. Note that these questions are not counted within the speech time of the Prime Minister because the points of clarification happen during the first Prime Minister's speech. So the government team should not be worried about losing time, and they should allow the opposition team to ask questions in a leisurely and flexible manner. Secondly, let's talk about points of information. During a speech, a member of the opposing team, whether that's Gov or Op, may offer a question to the current speaker. And that speaker can choose to either accept or not accept the POI. Note that if you answer a POI, that actually counts as part of your speech time, which means you need to take a balanced approach in considering whether to take or not take a POI. Taking a POI can be seen as good form and contributing to active interaction throughout the round. However, it may take away from your time to form and structure new arguments in your own speech. So that's always something to consider. And the last type of point is points of order, which is when a speaker calls a POO if they believe a rule has been violated. In general, the common POO calls pertain to speech time and new arguments in rebuttal speeches. As soon as a POO is called, the round is paused, and the judge will generally make a call regarding the POO. They may say the point is well taken, at which point they agree with the point of order, or they may say point not well taken, which means they disagree, or oftentimes they'll say they will take it under consideration and the round continues. Note that POO calls are not counted within speech time, so teams should not be worried about making a POO call if they believe that a rule has truly been violated. That's it. These are the main differences and the main rules to keep in mind when you come into parliamentary debate, and we wish you a great time at the Osterweis tournament this weekend. Thank you so much.